He smelled the sweet and bitter scent of defeat mixed with truffle oil. Chicago slept outside, but Steve, a 40-year-old chef, did not. His bed was the restaurant's grimy sofa. Each night there was a cruel reminder. His dream of success, his life. Everything was crumbling under the weight of unpaid bills and a system that seemed to devour those who worked hardest. The aroma of roasted garlic and fresh thyme still lingered in the air of the Gilded Spoon's kitchen. But for 40-year-old Steve, that scent, once synonymous with triumph, now carried the bitterness of failure. He dragged himself from the stove to the walk-in cooler, each movement a heavy burden. Years ago, he was Chicago's most talked-about chef. His name splashed across every culinary magazine. His hands, once skilled in creating high cuisine dishes, now trembled as he opened the electricity bill. Overtime hours vanished with rampant inflation and fewer customers. Steve worked the same hours, perhaps even more, but his salary, once enough for a charming Lincoln Park apartment, barely covered basic expenses. The reality was brutal. Rent was 3 months overdue, and he had nowhere to live but on the restaurant's couch. He saw his situation, an abyss of accumulated debt from when he dreamed of opening his own business. A special oven, expensive utensils, exotic ingredients for testing. Small luxuries that became shackles, weighing down every step he took. Steve's story was not isolated. He was the portrait of millions of Americans who, despite working tirelessly, found themselves on the brink of financial ruin. Recent Federal Reserve data indicates that about 39% of Americans could not cover an unexpected $400 expense. Steve, however, didn't need statistics to feel the suffocation. Anxiety was a constant, a knot in his stomach that prevented him from savoring even the dishes he prepared. He felt like a paradox, a man who fed others, but was starving for hope himself. His friends, fellow professionals, also faced similar challenges. One, a sommelier, had to sell his rare wine collection to pay medical bills. Another, a talented pastry chef, was delivering cakes in the early hours to supplement her income, sleeping very few hours a day. The stress was palpable in Chicago's kitchens, where the American dream seemed to be crumbling into ashes. The signs that Steve was on the verge of bankruptcy were glaring, but he had ignored them for too long, immersed in denial and the belief that everything would get better. The first clear sign was the inability to pay essential bills on time. First rent, then utilities. Next, he started using his credit card for daily expenses, accumulating exorbitant interest. Each month, the minimum credit card balance seemed like a lottery number, unattainable. He no longer had emergency savings. The little he had saved went to cover unexpected expenses and old debts. In a desperate attempt, Steve took out a personal loan, but the high interest rate only deepened the hole. He felt too ashamed to ask for help or even to admit his situation to his colleagues or family, believing it would be a sign of weakness. The truth is, Steve was stuck in a vicious cycle of denial and poor planning. The absence of a clear budget and inconsistent monitoring of his expenses prevented him from seeing the gravity of the situation until it was too late. The belief that a raise or more customers would solve everything was a mental trap that kept him stagnant. His mindset, focused solely on work and passion for gastronomy, neglected the financial aspect, a crucial piece in any endeavor, whether personal or professional. The lesson was painful. Identifying early warning signs and acting proactively is the only way to avoid a financial disaster. To get out of this situation, Steve needed an honest assessment of his financial situation. The crucial first step would be to create a detailed budget, listing every penny that came in and went out. Even in his desperate situation, he needed to visualize the problem. This would mean sitting down, instead of dreaming of Michelin-starred dishes, and confronting the reality of the numbers. He would need to identify essential and unnecessary expenses, no matter how painful it was to cut the daily coffee or the rare movie outings. every dollar mattered. Clarity was the first step to recovery, and he knew he could no longer postpone this task. The painful truth is that financial ruin often doesn't happen suddenly, but is a slow, gradual process, like water eroding rock. For Steve, the most valuable lesson would be the importance of financial self-awareness and immediate action. Ignoring the warning signs would only sink him deeper. He needed to face reality, no matter how harsh, and start rebuilding his financial life brick by brick. Steve's experience serves as a mirror for many. It takes courage to admit vulnerability and wisdom to seek the right tools to get back on your feet. Recovery would not be easy, but the first step had already been taken. He had finally recognized that he was on red alert. Steve had spent the night on the restaurant couch again. The mattress, which at first seemed like a refuge from harsh reality, now squeezed his back and neck, just like the pressure in his mind. He watched the city of Chicago wake up through the window, feeling like a ghost in his own life. The exhaustion was not just physical, but mental. The silence of the dawn gave way to the voices of economists and financial analysts he occasionally heard on the car radio, echoing in his head. They talked about the causes of bankruptcy, and Steve, even unwillingly, was now experiencing each of them. The feeling of being trapped with no way out was overwhelming. The reality, as personal finance experts in the U.S. point out, is that bankruptcy is rarely an isolated event. It's the result of a combination of factors, often interconnected. A study by the American Journal of Public Health revealed that medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States, accounting for approximately 66.5% of all bankruptcy filings. Although Steve wasn't directly facing medical debt, he understood how a single unexpected expense could trigger a domino effect. Other crucial factors include job loss or significant income reduction, something Steve experienced with reduced overtime hours and the impact of inflation on his purchasing power. The high cost of living, especially in major cities like Chicago, where the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment can easily exceed $1,800 per month, crushes many people's budgets. For Steve, his once robust salary simply couldn't keep up anymore. The lack of an emergency fund is another massive contributor to financial vulnerability. The majority of Americans, about 56%, according to a Bankrate survey, don't even have $1,000 in their savings accounts for unexpected expenses. Steve fit perfectly into this statistic. The little he had saved was quickly swallowed by car repairs, unexpected bills, and, of course, his equipment debts. Excessive reliance on credit cards and high-interest loans is the icing on the cake of the recipe for disaster. Steve, in his quest to maintain his lifestyle and finance his business dream, accumulated significant credit card debt. Compound interest turned small purchases into insurmountable mountains of debt. The average credit card interest rate in the U.S. often exceeds 20% per year, making debt repayment a constant and often lost battle. What many experts emphasize is the absence of basic financial education for most adults. It's not taught in schools how to manage money, invest, or deal with debt. The consequence is a population unprepared for the real-life economic challenges. Steve, despite being a master in the kitchen, did not have the same mastery over his finances. He was a classic example of someone who could create culinary wonders, but couldn't control the flow of money in his own bank account. The lack of knowledge about how to create a budget, how to save, and how to invest left him exposed to any financial storm that arose. Another cause, less tangible but equally devastating, is lifestyle inflation. As a person's income increases, their expenses also tend to increase, preventing the accumulation of wealth. Steve, in his years of success, lived comfortably, buying the best ingredients, frequenting expensive restaurants, and investing in state-of-the-art equipment for his future business. He didn't prepare for a downturn. The idea of living below your means was a strange concept to him. He was so focused on his passion and status that he didn't see the fragility of his situation. The hard truth that experts in Steve's experience reveal is that bankruptcy is not an inevitable fate, but rather the result of a series of choices and often a lack of preparation. The crucial lesson is that financial education, creating an emergency fund, and strict control of expenses are essential pillars for financial health. Steve, by understanding these deep causes, began to see a way out of the hole. The problem was not just inflation or lack of customers, but also his own approach to money, which left him vulnerable. He needed to change not only his habits, but his mindset. The next morning brought Steve a fragment of hope. He had made a decision while watching the sun rise over the Chicago skyline. He wouldn't give up. The idea of quitting, of abandoning his passion, and the city that had welcomed him for years, was more bitter than any culinary failure he had ever made. He knew he needed a plan, something concrete, to get out of that financial abyss. The shame of his situation still consumed him, but the urgency to act was greater. He could no longer afford to hide. The first and most painful, yet crucial, step for Steve was a complete analysis of his debts. He grabbed a notebook and began listing everything. The 3 months of overdue rent, the exorbitant credit card interest, the personal loans for equipment that now lay silent. The sum was frightening, nearly $30,000 in debt. To combat the feeling of overwhelm, he decided to use the debt snowball strategy, popularized by Dave Ramsey. The idea was simple. List all debts from smallest to largest, regardless of interest rate. The goal was to pay off the smallest debt first, and once it was paid off, use the amount that was being paid on it to attack the next largest debt. The sense of victory from eliminating a debt, even a small one, served as a fundamental psychological boost. Steve had an $800 debt on a credit card from a kitchen supply store. That would be the first to go. The second step was to drastically cut expenses. Steve analyzed every penny of his spending and realized there were many leaks in his budget, even now. He was paying for streaming services he barely used, subscriptions to culinary magazines that just collected dust, and, ironically, still ordered takeout a few times a week, even having access to a professional kitchen. He canceled all non-essential subscriptions, prepared his own meals with restaurant ingredients, and stopped socializing in expensive bars. The goal was to tighten his belt as much as possible, saving every dollar to attack his debts. This discipline was brutal, but necessary. The third crucial strategy for Steve was to seek extra income. The idea of side hustles wasn't new to him, but now it was an urgent necessity. He began offering private cooking classes in his free time, using the restaurant kitchen during off-peak hours, with the approval of the owner, who sympathized with his situation. Additionally, Steve used his skills to develop a small consulting service for smaller restaurants in neighboring areas, helping them optimize their menus and processes. The extra money was vital, and he directed 100% of that income toward his debts. The motivation was desperation, but the result was tangible. The debt balance began to decrease, albeit slowly. The fourth and most difficult strategy was negotiation with creditors. Steve, with the help of a pro bono financial counselor, began calling credit card companies and his landlord. With credit card creditors, he managed to negotiate lower interest rates on some of his debts, and in one case, even an extended payment plan. With his landlord, he explained his situation honestly, promising to pay a portion of the overdue rent every 2 weeks, in addition to the current rent. Transparency and proactivity, although difficult, proved effective. Steve's recovery was neither magical nor instantaneous. It was an arduous process, full of sacrifices and frustrations. But every small victory, every debt paid off, every dollar saved, was a step out of the hole. The lesson Steve learned was that discipline, the humility to ask for help, and proactivity are the keys to financial recovery. He wasn't just paying off his debts. He was rebuilding his mindset, and his relationship with money. Ruin, which once seemed like an end, became a new beginning, a catalyst for a new and more responsible financial life. With the first small victories in his battle against debt, Steve began to breathe a little easier. The restaurant couch was still a reality, but the nightly anguish diminished as the numbers on paper began to move in the right direction. He realized that it wasn't enough just to pay off debts. He needed to understand why he had reached that situation, so he would never fall into it again. The idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger had never made so much sense to him. Steve's journey to understand his financial failures led him to financial education. He started reading articles online, watching videos, and even attending some free workshops offered by the Chicago Public Library. What he discovered was shocking and, at the same time, liberating. He realized that many of the mistakes he made were incredibly common, especially among people who, like him, had never received any formal instruction about money. One of the most basic and widespread mistakes was the absence of a budget or the failure to stick to one. Statistics from the National Financial Capability Study show that only about 1/3 of Americans maintain a detailed budget, which leaves most vulnerable to overspending and lack of financial control. Another crucial mistake Steve identified in his own trajectory was the lack of an emergency fund. He always believed that, as a successful chef, he would be immune to unforeseen events. Reality hit him hard. Inflation, a drop in customers, and equipment debts left him without a safety net. Experts recommend having 3 to 6 months of living expenses saved in an emergency fund. Steve now saw this recommendation not as a luxury, but as an absolute necessity. He remembered when he had an unexpected health issue a few years ago and had to use his small fund to cover the costs, completely emptying it. If he had had more, the situation could have been different. The indiscriminate use of credit was another villain in Steve's story. He used his credit cards to finance his lifestyle and business dreams without fully understanding compound interest. High-interest personal loans followed soon after, pushing him to the brink. Financial education taught him about the pitfalls of revolving credit, about abusive interest rates, and about the importance of using credit strategically, not as an extension of his salary. He learned about the difference between good debt and bad debt. The lack of future planning was also a blind spot for Steve. He was so focused on the present, on the next perfect dish, that he never thought about retirement savings or long-term investments. The idea of building wealth seemed distant and complex. With financial education, he began to understand the basic principles of investing, the importance of compound interest working in his favor, and the need to start planning for the future, even on a tight budget. He heard of cases of people who started investing small amounts and, over decades, built significant fortunes. The main lesson Steve took from his financial education journey was that knowledge is power. Understanding how money works, how it can work for you, and how to avoid common pitfalls is not just for economists or financiers. It's an essential life skill, as important as cooking. He realized that many of his mistakes were made out of ignorance, not malice. And, with this knowledge, he was not only on the path to getting out of debt, but also to building a more secure and prosperous financial future. Financial education was not a cost, but an investment in himself. With newfound knowledge about financial education, Steve began to see opportunities where he once saw only dead ends. The idea of extra income ceased to be a last resort and became a powerful tool in his recovery. The restaurant couch was still his bed, but with every private cooking lesson he gave, every consultation for small restaurants he performed, every extra dollar that came in, he felt the wall of his financial prison crumble a little more. The shame of his situation was replaced by the determination to turn the tables. The first extra income strategy Steve delved into was using his skills and passions. As a chef, his culinary skills were obvious. He expanded his cooking classes, offering themed workshops for small groups, which he discreetly advertised on social media and to restaurant clients. Word of mouth worked, and he soon had a reasonable schedule. He also offered to cook for private events, such as dinners for small celebrations, charging a fair price for his time and expertise. The beauty of this approach was that he was doing something he loved, which made the extra work less exhausting and more rewarding. Additionally, Steve began exploring the gig economy. He signed up for food delivery platforms during his restaurant off hours. While it wasn't glamorous, each delivery represented money in his pocket that he could direct towards his debts. He also considered temporary catering jobs for larger companies, utilizing his days off. Diversifying his income streams was crucial, as he couldn't rely on just one gig. The flexibility of these jobs allowed him to balance them with his main restaurant work. With extra income starting to flow and debts diminishing, Steve, still with the help of his pro bono financial counselor, began to think about smart investments. He knew that, initially, the amounts would be small, but financial education had taught him about the power of compound interest and long-term investing. The initial strategy focused on low-risk and accessible investments, such as exchange-traded funds that replicate the performance of a broad market, like the S&P 500. He began allocating a small percentage of his extra income to these funds, even if it was just $50 or $100 per month. The idea was to start early and be consistent. Another investment strategy Steve explored was retirement savings through a 401. Although his employer didn't offer a matching plan, he researched individual retirement accounts, such as the Roth IRA, which allow contributions to be made with after-tax money and withdrawals in retirement to be tax-free. He learned that even small, regular contributions can grow exponentially over decades. The idea of securing his future after years of success and then nearly going bankrupt was a powerful motivator. Steve's journey to build extra income and invest smartly was not without its challenges. There were nights when he was exhausted, but the discipline to go to the next cooking class or make a few more deliveries kept him moving. The deepest lesson he learned was that hard work, creativity in finding new income streams, and patience in investments are fundamental. He wasn't looking to get rich quick, but rather to build a solid and sustainable financial foundation for the future. His story demonstrates that even in desperate situations, with the right strategies and mindset, it's possible not only to get out of the hole, but to start building a path to prosperity. It was a year and a half after Steve had begun his recovery journey. The restaurant couch was now just a distant memory. He had managed to pay off all his credit card debts and most of his personal loans. Rent was current, and he had even managed to save a small emergency fund. Exhaustion was still an occasional companion, but now it was a satisfying exhaustion, the result of hard work and progress, not despair. He had moved into a smaller, more affordable, but cozy apartment in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood. Peace of mind was his new secret ingredient. Staying financially secure, however, is an ongoing challenge, not a final destination. Steve knew he needed a long-term plan to prevent past mistakes from repeating. The first and most fundamental strategy he adopted was creating a strict budget and conducting regular reviews. He had learned that a budget was not a straitjacket, but rather a financial map. Each month, he would sit down to review his expenses and income, adjusting as needed. He used a simple money management app that helped him track every dollar, making the process easier and less burdensome. The discipline of knowing where his money was going was the foundation of his financial security. The second vital strategy was the continuation and growth of his emergency fund. The initial goal of 3 months of expenses had been met, and he was now working towards 6 months. He knew that life is full of unpredictable events: a car breaking down, a medical emergency, a job loss. Having a robust financial cushion was his number one priority. He set up automatic transfers from his checking account to his emergency savings account, ensuring that part of his income went there before he even had a chance to spend it. The third strategy Steve implemented was continuous and diversified investing. With his debts under control, he could direct a larger portion of his income toward investments. He continued to contribute to his IRA and began exploring additional index fund investments, diversifying his portfolio. He wasn't seeking high risks. His priority was consistent growth over time. He also educated himself on the importance of diversification, not putting all his eggs in one basket, spreading his investments across different asset types. The fourth strategy was the pursuit of sustainable and scalable extra income. Steve continued his cooking classes and consultations, but now in a more structured way, creating a small formal business with a website and social media profile. He no longer depended on these gigs to survive, but rather to accelerate his financial goals, such as making a down payment on an apartment or investing more in his future. He also began to think about digital products, such as recipe ebooks or online courses, to create a passive income stream that wouldn't require his constant time. The final and most enduring lesson Steve absorbed on his journey was the importance of financial resilience and a long-term mindset. Bankruptcy was not just a financial event. It was a life lesson that transformed him. He understood that financial security is not achieved once and for all, but is a continuous process of learning, adaptation, and discipline. He was no longer just a talented chef. He was a talented and financially conscious chef, ready for whatever challenges life might throw his way. His story is a testament that, even in the depths of despair, change is possible, and building a sustainable future is within reach for everyone who dedicates themselves to learning and acting.